Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Michael Gurven. Michael is an evolutionary anthropologist and professor at University of California, Santa Barbara. He has conducted fieldwork for 2 decades with South American indigenous populations, and his work takes an evolutionary perspective on behavior, health, physiology, and psychology. He's also got a lab. He's been co-director of the Tsimane Health and Life History Project to better understand how aspects of environment and lifestyle affect health and lifespan in subsistence-level societies. His research applies an evolutionary lens to help inform our understanding of today's complex diseases. And he is the author of the new book, 7 Decades, How We Evolved to Live Longer. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about how we got to this kind of 7 decades average for humans, and how our evolutionary story and history has kind of brought us to that kind of average. We talk a lot about post-reproductive life. So obviously from an evolutionary perspective, we have an emphasis on getting our genes to the next generation. And so once people reach past the ability to reproduce, we talk about, well, there's still decades that we live for humans, and we're not the only ones. There's other species as well. So we talk about post-reproductive life. We spend a large part of our time on health span versus lifespan. So I really enjoyed that part of the conversation. Of course, we talk about subsistence populations, so various indigenous people groups in South America and other parts of the world. We spend a good amount of time on multi-generational cooperation, some really fascinating stuff in this part of the conversation. We, of course, talk about older age, what things might look like in the future for how long we live and what the quality of life is. Is it always going to be 7 decades? Are we going to move up to 8 or 9 or maybe even past that? So we talk a little bit about that and many other wonderful topics. I really enjoyed this conversation with Michael. He's a wonderful person, and he's obviously very brilliant. He's been doing great research, and I really just enjoyed talking with him about many important topics that have impact for all of us. As always, you can find this conversation and all the conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So get over there to the Substack, subscribe. That always helps. Share with your friends. I have many other conversations that are similar in terms of evolution or anthropology or cultural evolution, many topics. So there's a big back catalog. So get over there and subscribe, tell your friends, and now I bring you Michael Gurven. I am here with Michael Gurven. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk with you.
Thanks for inviting me. Really happy to talk about it.
Yeah, you have a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. I guess it's been kind of a while since I've read a really good, popular science. There's elements of obviously anthropology and obviously a lot of evolution, and I've obviously talked about it a lot on the podcast, but there is a sort of, like anything else, you start to, hear kind of the same things, kind of the same people, theorists, things like that. And so this was really wonderful. It was really fresh and novel, but familiar at the same time, and just a really fantastic concept. The book is called 7 Decades, How We Evolved to Live Longer. Important subtitle. And so we're going to talk all about it. Before we do, why don't you just tell listeners kind of who you are professionally, academically, and any of the relevant details.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on. And, I appreciate, had you started by saying, I really hate your book, that would have been an interesting, intro.
It would have been interesting. It would have been interesting.
See what, but no, that's I'm really happy to hear. I mean, above all, I just want people to enjoy it. And, I'm trying to reach a broader audience with this book. It's my first kind of book that I've written. So my name is Michael Gurven. I'm an anthropologist. I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the kind of anthropologist. Many people don't really know what that is. People think I either dig fossils or I just kind of stare into my navel and make up stories, and it's a mix of all of that. But I prefer working with living people, and I'm kind of a mix of a biological and cultural anthropologist. And so for me, it's really just been what can we learn from studying some of the few remaining groups of people who still have life ways that resembled more how we used to live prior to industrialization. So these are hunter-gatherers, small-scale farmers, herders, and I didn't actually start off studying health and aging per se. I was actually really interested in cooperation. I just wanted to know, how do people make a living with such a kind of difficult job? Basically, what happens if you stub your toe, you break your arm, and you can't work for a few days? How do people get by? And so, it's not hard to think then, all right, if you were studying cooperation in that context, I can see how that's relevant to health and how that's relevant to aging and aging well. And so, you were mentioning, I think right before you hit record, that the book talks a lot about cooperation, even though it's a book about aging and health. So, it kind of came full circle. So yeah, I study broadly lots of things related to health, aging, from the nitty gritty, epigenetic age, and physiological biomarkers to just people's stories about what makes for a good life and, people's mental health. So I like anthropology because it's very holistic, right? You can jump from studying depression one week and then talk about caregiving, the next week, and then spinning back to, ApoE genes and risks of cardiovascular disease. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's who I am.
You're never bored. If you start doing one thing, I'm kind of tired of the genetic thing. Let me go over here to maybe some of the more biological piece or the mental health side, or that's got to be a cool thing to do, to jump around a bit.
Yeah, I mean, you say that, but that's actually really true, right? Like I do like to have my fingers dipped in different pies, and what's really beautiful though is that sometimes when they all kind of connect, right? So they're not like disparate anymore, and that was kind of what I was trying to do with this book. I sent advanced chapters and to some colleagues and such, and various people, depending on their specialty, were like, do you really need this whole chapter on depression? Get rid of that.
I love that chapter.
Or do you need, and then the more psychological, like, do you really need all this stuff on these other things? But yeah, it's got it all, I think, and I'm glad to hear you say you love that chapter, because personally that was one of my favorite chapters.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. Well, I mean, kind of in my world, there's a lot of problems with psychologists, but one of the problems is that I think it's like a lot of fields are kind of like that. They start to become very kind of parochial, and it's just like the clinical world, and that's very important. We need good clinicians, but I think having an evolutionary kind of based model, which is really, really important, understanding what it's like for systems, you can do a biopsychosocial kind of model, but looking at it more generally for humans, past and present, like it just kind of like gives it so much more context and understanding of things that I think is sometimes missed. So yeah, I love that chapter. I thought it was great.
Great.
So, okay, the first question here is you write a book on 7 decades. How long are we supposed to live, right? From an evolutionary perspective, you make the claim, we'll talk about it in at different points, I'm sure, but we have evolved to live 7 decades. It's not like we got to the 21st century and all of a sudden we're living, into our 70s. You make the claim that there was always these kind of traces or kind of hints in our evolutionary history that we could live that long, and for some people even longer. And now it's not, I'm not that old, but when I was younger, if you met someone that was 100, it was like, oh my God, like, like, wow. But it's not uncommon for people to live into the early mid 90s now. So, yeah, why 7 decades? How long are we supposed to live? And is that continuing to shift for the average human lifespan?
Yeah, thanks. Great first question. Uh, yeah, you definitely put yourself out there when you specify a number, right? Like I could have called it like 72, but and 7 decades is a rough estimate. Uh, and I do think sometimes people get it or think differently about what I meant by that. So especially, I gave a talk, early version of this a couple of years ago, and there were a lot of people in their 80s and 90s in the audience. And so, their first reaction was like, wait, are you saying we shouldn't even exist? Like we're wrong, or we're miracle people because we've survived beyond 7 decades. And it's more like the plan. If you're building a machine, how long, should it last for the most part? And of course, we often think in terms of life expectancy, and we know that life expectancies over large courses of our history, including fairly recently in many parts around the world, was much lower than 7 decades, right? Well into, say the 30s. And okay, but I spent some time in the book kind of, well, that's because there's so much death early in life, right? And that if you get past, all of those calamitous, years, then you do tend to see like a distribution of deaths that looks kind of like a bell curve around about 7 decades or so. And my first hunch about 7 decades actually was a bit inductive. It's not like I on the back of a napkin made a calculation and like, oh, it should be 7 decades. It was just realizing that in every hunter-gatherer group where there's good demographic information so that you reasonably know people's ages and you reasonably know, who lived and who died. When you kind of look at the distribution of ages of death or lifespans, in adulthood, it seems to be in this range of like 65 to 75. And so, technically, I call that the modal age of death, right, as opposed to the average lifespan. And it sort of gives a different perspective on like, why is it then that, if folks make it past adolescence, they seem to be making it, about 7 decades. And this might be true, I think, over large swaths of our evolutionary history. I kind of even go through some of the paleo literature, which is enormously difficult to do, and I make some guesstimates of around 7 decades based on completely with the absence of evidence, but just like based on these statistical relationships we've seen between brain size, body size, and how long, like maximum lifespan. And so certainly when humans see big increases in their brain sizes, that would be a good clue when, okay, lifespan was probably shifting alongside that. So even in the absence of actual like fossilized, skeletons and such, we can make guesses about the past. But it's not like a fixed set in stone. So I do think, if I were writing about now, and I do treat this in the book, probably because the book's a little bit too long and I don't get to 8 and 9 decades until like later on in the book. And so, yeah, now that modal distribution of adult lifespans is closer to 8 and 9 decades. So I would say, yeah, we are living longer lifespans now compared to most of our evolutionary history. And I'm not even talking about the centenarians, right? But just like there's more and more people that are living through, those 80s and 90s. And so it is a very different story. And we can get into like, are we just sort of, tolerating the punches better, or is aging really slowed down? What really explains that shift from 7 decades to 9 decades? We definitely, because we know we're surviving longer, but are we actually healthier longer? Is some of the real basic questions that got me started in this field was like, a 72-year-old Hadza, are they biologically like, a 58-year-old Frenchman, or is it the other direction? And it wasn't even obvious. Like, on one level, you can think if you've made it to 72 years, you must be pretty robust, pretty strong. And so maybe, you actually are healthier than people in other places, where, just me wearing these glasses, how long would I survive, in the wild? So yeah, it wasn't very obvious. And just even brainstorming how you would even think about answering a question like that pretty much opens up so many interesting areas, and just realizing that there's so much basic stuff we don't know. And that was what I thought was missing from a lot of conversations about aging and longevity, and why, I thought I would write the 134th book on aging and longevity.
I guess the question I have here is, it's not necessarily the why question, but it's sort of in that world. Is when you look at different animals, you'll see that they have a kind of, a floor and a ceiling of sorts, right? Of age, and then they'll have like the median kind of average, whatever, of their life expectancy. So we know that parrots live for 50, 60 years. Elephants live 70 years, right? But the octopus lives max 4 years, usually 2.5, 3, and whatever, right? And all of these are for maybe not particular reasons, but I guess when it comes to Homo sapiens, for humans, something that has very much fascinated me, I'm kind of jumping a little ahead here, but it is when humans become kind of post-reproductive age, from an evolutionary perspective, it's like, well, what the hell is the point? Like, why are you sticking around? Like, why don't you just like, right? I mean, it sounds like such a cynical way of talking about, humans, but if there's, look, if understanding aging and the lifespan in evolutionary terms is, okay, how do we get our genes into the next generation? How do we maximize reproductive fitness? Well, why do we need to be 70 or 80 or 90 or whatever? I mean, obviously, males can have, humans can have, an ejaculate that's still potent until their 80s or 90s, but it's not going to be like you are when you're 20 or 30. And obviously with women, there's they're unable to have children after a certain age. So yeah, I guess what do we see with it's not even, you can't even say it's old, quote unquote, adults, 65 plus. I mean, it really is 45, post 40, 45, evolutionary speaking, where it's like, okay, like we're not hanging around for 10 years. We're hanging around for 40 years sometimes. So from an evolutionary stance, like what's, I guess, the utility for humans living past, and if you want, you can introduce, health span here as opposed to lifespan, if you want to do that. But yeah, tell us about this kind of framing.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head here, that it's not just about why are we living longer than maybe people would have thought we lived before, but also, wait a minute, if you're extending life, you're not extending all aspects of life, including namely reproduction, right? Why? Right. That seems crazy, especially because as conditions have improved, we do the onset of reproduction has gotten potential earlier and earlier, right? We see menarche occurring earlier and earlier, but menopause, it could be creeping up a little bit later, but not at the same rate. And right. So there's definitely a constraint there, that it seems like no matter how good condition you are, you're not going to be reproducing naturally through natural means as a woman, at 55, years of age. And So presumably there's got to be some logic to there. And this is where, well, if you think that living beyond 50 years of age is very novel, then there's nothing really to explain. It's just that we're miraculously, living longer. And yeah, the case that I'm making is that no, I think because we've been typically had that potential to live a lot longer, for much longer swaths of time, then there is something there to actually explain. And in fact, in many hunter-gatherers, 30 to 40%, or at least 30 to 40% of adulthood is spent in that post-reproductive phase. So it's not just that we live a few years beyond menopause, but that there is an actual post-reproductive life stage. So it's actually not really true that, humans are the only species that have menopause. Lots of species have menopause. They just don't tend to live very long past that. And the closest, in fact, there's only about 4 or so other species that really show a similar kind of pattern. And
is it dolphins? Is that right? Orcas?
Yeah, so basically whales, right? So killer whales, baleen whales, the short-finned pilot whale, beluga whales, and even, and it's amazing. And in many ways, they show similarities with sort of the human story, that they both, like humans, they have a fairly difficult kind of foraging niche, and, adults and even grandparents, help out, and they provision young, and they've even been known to kind of help teach foraging skills during years where getting salmon was really difficult. And so you see this sort of investment in younger generations. And that's kind of some of the leading ideas for, okay, if you're not reproducing past the age of 50, then are you somehow indirectly reproducing? Because you're right, that from a natural selection perspective, if you're not passing genes to future generations, then we didn't evolve just to live as long a life as possible for its own sake. And so there's got to be some kind of reason. And the idea that you could then, could you actually benefit more, instead of having children yourself at those later ages, you could help improve the survival of your existing children, and maybe even help the survival and the fertility of other generations, grandchildren. And so, these kinds of ideas about the grandmothering hypothesis, and that grandparents more generally, and even parents, right? Because if you had your last child, say, at 40, and, that last child's not going to be, fledged and independent until probably well past the age of menopause, then there's lots of ways that middle-aged older adults can make a difference in terms of their fitness, and it might be a better option than continuing reproduction, especially if there's something about the quality of eggs. It's really when you delve deeper, there's all these other questions, like the very fact that you've already lost a huge chunk of your eggs by the time you give birth.
Yeah.
Right. Like atresia, like this process of like egg loss. So there's definitely some quality control mechanisms such that the hormonal feedback loops break up. In the 40s, perimenopause, and eventually until there's no more eggs. That there's something there, and so on the cost side, it might be that there's some quality issues. There could be complications with birth, so that if mom died in childbirth, and again, maternal mortality was definitely a lot higher in the past, but it could be even higher if you continued to birth in those later ages, and which almost guarantees that your children probably aren't going to make it. So there's a lot going on the cost side if you continued reproduction to later ages, and there's a lot potentially going on with the benefit side. And part of the whole key, the reason why middle-aged and older adults can even matter in the first place, is because we have such a difficult foraging ecology and socio-ecology that it requires, it basically makes it so that kids really are dependent on others well past the point of just being able to walk, and even being a fully kind of grown. Like an adolescent, basically in a hunter-gatherer world, is still basically dependent on others for their food. They don't graduate hunter-gatherer high school until about the same age as we do. And which is pretty amazing to think about, right? Because if you have multiple children and all these kids are fairly dependent, then it really creates room where adults and surplus can really make a difference. And so that's kind of the whole story about weaving together how like the ecology and the environment, once we kind of shifted from the trees down to the savannas and took on hunting and gathering seriously, that there were real costs involved, and the dependency of children was a big one, and yet that potential to then benefit those kids and adolescents meant that there was room for what older adults could accomplish. And so it really is this sort of multi-generational kind of argument that sort of is the foundation for why then there might have been incentives for our early ancestors that lived a few years beyond menopause saw some benefit, and that actually led to some selection for even further reductions in later mortality, so that the lifespan expanded even further. But the case I make throughout the book, and I think it's been missed a little bit in the evolutionary world, when we think about grandmothers, it's usually not like, well, grandmothers even in their 90s versus grandmothers in their 60s, that not, a lot is happening with age. And that there is actually a point where grandparental benefits, they can still be contributing, but the costs of staying alive become too great, and those benefits are starting to dwindle when grandparental productivity in many different domains is also dwindling. And so, yeah, that's kind of the argument then why around 7 decades seems to be around that time period where you see this switch where older adults are kind of switching from being assets to being more burdens on their kin. And that wouldn't really be favored by selection out of just sheer love, keeping older adults alive at age 90 if their net drains on the resources would sort of be in the opposite direction of how kin selection and all that kind of stuff works. So
yeah, I'll definitely come back to the grandmother hypothesis is something that's fascinated me for a long time. So we'll continue more with that. But I guess this idea of the health span more than the lifespan.
Yeah.
More specifically, a lot of places have looked, or a lot of groups have looked at the role or the impact of quality of life, right? You could live to 78, but if your quality of life sucks, it's like, well, it doesn't mean that there's nothing worth living for, but right, if you're taking 17 pills a day, you gotta, walk with a walker, you can't remember what you did for lunch, like you start to look at qualitatively how is life for you than just a chronological age. So the health span, I think, becomes more important here. I'll just say something about what you were saying about there's this spot of post-menopausal, let's say for women, or where it's okay, 40, 45, and then about, 67, 65, 70. Yeah, I mean, most of the neurocognitive disorders that we see, Alzheimer's, dementia, post, kind of just general mild cognitive impairment, usually have, if you're going to have it, post 75. Now, of course, people do have, early onset or, things like that, unfortunately. But, we really do see a kind of neurodegenerative, more rapidly conditions for people post 75, right? And people in their 80s and even 90s, with exceptions, are going to have some type of, cardiovascular issue or neurodegenerative issue or things like that. It's virtually almost impossible. It's just mileage on the body, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it is curious, right? How like even post, reproductive value, if you will, it's not like till you breathe your last at 97. It's like, you kind of get to that 7th decade, and then you do start to become a little bit more, taking a little bit more care and, things like that. So maybe just here, yeah, you can elaborate on some of those things, but kind of hone in on this health span thing, which I think is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, like you were saying before, we have centenarians now, but no centenarian, I think, lives independently, and probably only about half, from one study I saw, are cognitively intact. And
Yeah.
so even going from 7 decades, to 8 or 9 decades, you're still seeing big increases in from cancers to everything in sixth, seventh decades of life, and you're right. The health span, and the lifespan, health span kind of gap. It's interesting because over life expectancy has, except for some dips, with COVID and such, it's been still creeping up, and health span's been creeping up, but not at the same rate. We're losing out, and we're not getting with big increases in life expectancy. We're getting both good years and bad years, right? The ideal is we hope that we're only going to get good years, and that just doesn't seem to be the case. It hasn't been the case for the last several decades that this has been tracked, and in places. So the U.S. actually, it turns out, is the worst. In every country that's been looked at, in the gap between lifespan and health span, there's about 12-year gap in the U.S.
A big gap. That's a big gap.
That's a big gap. And the global average is not that far off, but it's like 9 to 10 years. But in the greatest country in the world, that's a big gap, and it's not exactly what you think. It's not like, well, it's just 78. You're healthy up till 78, and then the last 12 years are bad. Part of it is just because partly the way health span gets measured. Lifespan's easy because you're either alive or you're dead.
Mm-hmm.
But health span is basically you have to take your health from a scale of like where if 1 is death and 0 is like perfect health, then any condition that you have, is something in between. And it actually turns out even things like just lower back pain, right, which, seems fairly trivial, but the fact that so many Americans have lower back pain, writ large, it kind of adds up quite big, and actually contributes to some portion of that health span lifespan gap. And so I think, even though we're seeing increases in lifespan, we're not getting it for free, right? That we're seeing increases and proportionally, more kind of unhealthy years. And I do think that, our ability to, continue reducing mortality, some of it is just we're not getting any healthier. We're just that much more likely to survive certain things, but in a continued unhealthy state. And I think that that's not really going to change unless there's some major breakthrough, right? And this is the whole field of geroscience that, rather than trying to treat one disease at a time, like let's just address aging. And if we could slow down aging, maybe that would affect, every disease. And, I think we've actually done, some of that in actually going from the 7 decades to the 9 decades. We have a better energy budget, better diet, many ways, more reliable food. We've gotten rid of so many of infections. So I do think we have more energy that can be shunted towards staying alive and staying, tolerating, different things that happen, so that we've done a decent job of slowing things down. But to think that we're just going to be able to continue on that same path seems to me overly optimistic, and all the data seems to suggest that that's not the case, even in the last couple of years. So
I wonder if some of that is because, for many hundreds of years, people died from like infection, right? People died from not having healthy sanitation, like, cleaning your hands after, using the restroom, or, things like that. I mean, even just like, what's the estimates of, how many millions of lives penicillin has saved? It's just something basic, like the things we take for granted now, but for hundreds of years, it's like, oh yeah, like, 35, it's maybe you'll see 40, because we just didn't have ways to ward off
Yeah.
infection. I mean, there are other things too, such as like blood transfusions, like, like how, or, getting like, kind of the COVID example is like, I mean, it's used for other things too, but, what are they called? The machines, uh, I guess they're like respiratory machines or whatever, where you get intubated. I'm forgetting the name,
Oh yeah,
but
with oxygen concentrators and all that stuff. Yeah.
right. They basically, outsource your lungs for you if you need it, So, before people would die of like walking pneumonia. Now you can, it's just, there's these advances, but it doesn't mean that it's advancing your life per se. It's just, it's almost like there's like kind of meeting, like kind of catching up to like the maximum of what we probably could do as humans. And we're not going to get more than that anymore. It's just like, yeah, on your own. Okay. You figure all these things out, and okay, you have some help or some addition, but it's not going to make you live longer per se. And then of course we have, medications and good diet and all these things, but like it does, yeah, just seem we do have a ceiling. Like we do have a ceiling of how long we could live, even if you have like the perfect conditions.
Yeah, and I think when we got rid of most infections, it's not like, okay, then what's left is just all degenerative diseases. I think one upshot of that was, not competing and sharing resources with different pathogens in our body means, well, we're bigger, right? We can grow more, and we have stronger immune systems. And so we are actually able perhaps to, tolerate the slings and arrows better throughout the rest of the life course. So it has an effect that trickles through. And I do think, that's partly what helps get us, beyond 7 decades. And so, if we do everything right, and, from eating well to, being physically active and avoiding all the harmful things, we'll probably do like, Japan, San Marino, Monaco, these places that have the highest life expectancies that are, in their mid 80s. That's, I think, getting somewhat close to how good we could probably reasonably get without, game-changing regenerative medicine, swapping out organs every time they fail, and just, slowing that, changing the whole cellular machinery outright. And yeah, I that seems to be what the data are showing. But that's not as sort of a sexy story, if you're kind of a longevity tech bro and want to.
Well, yeah, we want to live forever. We want to live into the 22nd century, and blah blah blah, right?
Yeah, and that's where, it's funny. I got a review the other day, and the reviewer, I think, thought I was being overly cynical about investing in anti-aging technology and that kind of stuff. And it's not. I actually think, and I even say this about this book, about what my book's trying to do differently than other books. I think it's great that there's people out there that are pushing the envelope, right? So many things that were said could never be done, and then they are done. And so it's great, but not everyone should be doing that. And I do think there is a reality about now that really does kind of focus what can we actually prevent, right? So prevention is sort of kind of key, right, to delaying the horrors of aging, rather than just hoping for the Band-Aids and the pills that will get us through things once we've already developed type 2 diabetes or have advanced atherosclerosis and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that stuff does need to be done, but there's a lot of effort about living, quality life that I think we can focus on the here and now. And many of it is actually cheaper than investing billions in anti-aging technology. So, when it does come to, how much more years can you get for, every, $1 million invested, then that's an interesting argument to have. And there's plenty of things that could be done that might not be slowing aging down specifically. But if our main goal was just to increase life expectancy, and I actually think life expectancy is a reasonable thing to think about because it gets at, these aspects of how long can we really live? Like once you've lived to 60, how do we get to 90, 100? But it also gets to, so it's a balance between that and how many of us can actually get to 60 in the first place, right? So as life expectancy is increasing, it's actually the inequality in lifespans is reducing, right? Because fewer people are dying throughout the life course. Many more are making it to those later years. So I think it's kind of a win-win of like, how could the most people live the longest life possible? And if that's the metric you want to maximize, all of a sudden, what you're going to put your energy could be very different, right? You might actually want to be focusing on, early education. You might want to be focused on, making sure everyone just gets diagnostics, right? Routine screening. Those things are very cheap, but can make a huge difference in terms of morbidity. Let alone, one of the reasons that a country like the U.S. actually loses out in the life expectancy competition with other high-income countries, it isn't because of, dying at, Alzheimer's at different rates, the things that are happening at very late ages. In fact, the relative difference, once you make it to 75 between those countries is not all that great. It's really about earlier in life, right? The opioid abuse, the gun-related deaths, the things that don't have very much to do with aging per se, but can make a huge difference in increasing life expectancy in the U.S. and in other places. So anyway, that's my...
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that I totally agree. It's... I don't want to make this comparison per se, but I kind of sort of see it of like, some religious folks that are always looking to the afterlife and of like, oh, well, then it's going to be great. It's like, maybe, sure, that might be nice, but like, let's not miss what we have now and try to be more preventative. Have more preventative care. How do we boost quality of life? So I kind of see these people that are like, yeah, I'm going to try and spend billions of dollars, to so I can live to 110, kind of, or I don't know. And I get I've gone back and forth on this of like, would I want to live for, hundreds of years? And it's like, yeah, if I could just kind of park at like, 35, then sure. But, and like, cause I want to see all the stuff, I want to see all the things. I want to see all the history and all the good art and, whatever. But on another hand, it's like, oh my God, that would feel like the ride that never ends. So, I don't know. But, I totally agree with you on this. I think that we have to focus on quality of life that we have. And obviously, in the past 70 years, we've, and increasingly every decade, we're pushing, more preventative, health and all of these things. And so, but even still, even if we find the cure to, cancer and Alzheimer's and all these things, it doesn't mean we're going to live to be 120. It just means we're not going to die from those things. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Everywhere around the world, you basically see, this exponential increase in mortality at later ages. And yet the composition of deaths varies from place to place. And yet everything still seems to follow this trajectory. And so when you take away one death, then you just see more, or one cause, you see more people dying from a different cause. And so that's exactly right. I don't think getting rid of any one or two causes is going to make a huge dent in how long that people are typically living. And
And
yet,
again, to be clear, I'm not saying, I don't think you're saying that we should just abandon cancer research.
yeah.
Listen, we should be going full steam ahead on that. I'm just saying it's not going to make us live to 140. It's just going to make us not die from cancer at 70.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right, and I think what we expect with the near future anyway. There's so many unmet needs, right?
Yeah.
That related to caregiving and quality of life and social isolation and there's so many other things that need attention now that we know about, and we can do that at the same time that we're working to try to cure cancer and that we're really trying to figure out how to stave off Alzheimer's and that kind of. It's not like we have to put all of our eggs in one basket, but I do think we do need to pay attention. Are all these baskets being filled? And there's not a whole lot. I mean, now we've seen some attention, about loneliness, but much more attention than actual, initiatives. The kinds of initiatives that actually aren't simple pills or shots. It's so much harder to think about. And prevention is so unsexy, right? When it comes to thinking about aging and longevity, even though it can be the most effective, but it involves all these like broader structural changes that are much harder to think about. But I do think those conversations need to be had much more than they have been, if we really want to be serious about quality of life. And I actually do think there's already the beginnings of this now, that life expectancy is high enough in lots of places that there's an understanding that metric alone is not enough. So there's health span, right, which is nice for sort of distilling unhealthy, healthy years. But then what about happy versus unhappy and different aspects of quality? So I think we are going to start seeing, at the national level and for every different country, some ways of trying to measure these things. And then once you can measure them and compare them, and then it's like, okay, now we can work to improve it. It's just going to be more of a target. But it's not a target yet because it seems like slippery and uncontrollable and whimsical. But ultimately, when you talk to people about growing old and their fears about growing old, these are the things that really matter. I mean, it's pretty surprising that people fear aging more than they fear actual dying, from lots of polls.
I agree. I think it is extremely hard to find objective, measurable outcomes of quality of life, happiness, contentment. It's hard. And it's definitely hard to scale that. It's definitely hard to have that across different, groups. So even in trying to just measure something as sort of amorphous and, intangible, then it becomes, well, it's like a lot of these things. It's like, what are we talking about, right? When you're looking at what is the intrinsic subjective experience from person to person of how to measure an emotion like happiness or contentment, a kind of, state or mood. How do you measure that? And listen, us psychologists can't even figure that out. So, so maybe it needs someone outside the box to figure it out. But, it is hard. It's really, really hard because of how I think there's it's ensconced with the sociality of humans and how ever changing we are with those things, that it becomes really difficult to find how to measure it and what are some, when you're thinking about the kind of the test construction of how to measure these things, it becomes a real challenge in those ways. I think, again, it should be done, but it is difficult to do.
Yeah, and I think it was difficult to do that for healthspan. But, and it's not a perfect system, and there's been critiques and whatnot and various versions of it. But at least starting somewhere can be useful. And you're right. Certainly, in every list of things you should pay attention to live long, healthy life, blue zoney type stuff,
Hmm.
does always focus on sense of purpose, meaning, contentment, at a deeper scale. It might not mean you're happy all the time as in a, emotional scale, but like, yeah, having purpose. And that stuff transfers over if we're talking about hunter gatherers, if we're talking about, people in DC and Baltimore, and even the fact the sociality, right? The fact that, let's just say you have Social Security and you have a reliable, stable income and you have a house and you have all your material needs are met. And so a lot of the reasons why, sociality is so useful in, small scale societies is because of the way sociality matters for just buffering against all kinds of risks. But just because even if you are super successful in being buffered, we still get lonely, right? That sociality still matters. Like we can't evolve that away from us and just be, uh, content. And so we might have imperfect ways of measuring it, but probably if we just say, well, we can't really measure it perfectly in a great comparable way, ignoring it altogether is not going to help. And so, I think there has been some good advances in trying to measure these things. And even you can do it in a way where at least people using the same yardstick can be comparable.
Hmm.
So like I've asked these questions about contentment and purpose and happiness and life satisfaction with the Tsimane, and I think it's reasonably comparable for the Tsimane. Now, is it the same yardstick as that we would use in Baltimore? Probably not. But I also haven't worked super hard to try to like make sure the goalposts are the same, so that
Hmm.
then we're using the exact same scale. But that is kind of what people in this industry do. So I
Hmm.
don't think it's totally unreasonable that we couldn't come up with those
Sure.
kinds of measures. And that's just, that was just sort of like a digression of like, can we measure these sort of more qualitative aspects of life? And, any good empiricist, I think, would say, yeah, we can, albeit imperfectly, but we could do something. We can make progress. Uh, so that, and once you can quantify things, then it does sort of put it on a map where, all right, we could work towards something. We could work towards improving this metric, and treat
Hmm.
it the same way we treat GDP, or the same way we treat life expectancy. I feel
Yeah.
like if it doesn't show up on the World Bank, for indicators, then it doesn't get really taken seriously and it gets ignored.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, I'm optimistic that we can do that because of people are doing good research on that. And it's like everything else. We'll make good steps forward, and then we'll kind of get stuck for a little bit, and then go again. So I do feel optimistic though. So okay, so tell us about subsistence populations. That's the kind of the fancy term. But currently, and I'll give you some runway on this. So I'll just set it up for you. Um, there are still around the world, in different parts of the world, these sort of hunter gatherer populations, and so subsistence population is kind of the sexy term for it. But I guess, why do so many people, anthropologists, sociologists, I guess, some psychologists, like, go to these places in South America, in Africa, in Asia, to try and look at people that, again, don't live exactly like how humans lived 50,000 years ago, but there's some traces there. They're not a monolithic group. I mean, it's sort of a kind of way we've organized, these folks all kind of have a similar hunter gatherer lifestyle, but of course each group is unique in their own way. But why do we go to these places to try and observe and interact or whatever, to like learn from them? Like, what can we learn about them that's different from westernized or modernized people? How much inference can we make to how humans were thousands of years ago? And those are all kind of general setting the table. But then for you specifically, how did you see this for understanding older age and then longevity into a couple of decades? So yeah, I'll give you a bunch of run room on that.
Yeah, thank you. That was a well uh, laid out version of the question, like my mother would ask, like, Michael, why are you going to the jungle? And, of course, why am I making my mother sound like Harvey Firestein? But uh, yeah, basically, what are you going there for? What do you think you can learn there that Yeah, and I do think there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. One answer just has nothing to do with evolution at all. One could just say, look, these folks who are living in these more remote rural areas are just ignored, or poorly treated, or have land rights issues, and so the most marginalized of the marginalized, and so if we care about their well-being just like everyone else, then maybe we need to put some attention on that and on them, and that's sort of one of the threads. One could argue I probably didn't do a great job, in the book, because it's sort of tacked on, but like, it's always like, what can we learn about us from studying people, in the jungle? Whereas I do want to, those people in the jungle have needs, and if their life expectancy is much lower, they have every right, right to live and improve their lives as much as possible. How can that happen? So how can we take all of our knowledge and help improve their lives as well? And so there's that whole kind of element. But in many ways, there's not that many people going to these places. Anthropologists do it less and less than they used to. I try to address this in the book. I have colleagues that think just the virtue of the fact that I work with indigenous populations, that I must be somehow exploitative, and much less if I'm collecting blood and you're measuring biomarkers, that's somehow evil to some extent, which is ridiculous. But I think it does really force you to say, yeah, why do you really think there's something to learn here that you couldn't just learn, and even maybe in a more controlled setting, that in a better setting in other places? And that's where I do, and I hope I make the case for that in the book, because it's not even a popular view in the aging world. I think in a lot of aging world, I think you would never work in small scale societies, because it's believed that people are dying of so many things that don't have to do with aging. And so you really would work in low mortality settings, where most people are dying of aging related illnesses, and that's where you would go to study aging. But I do think, the deeper kind of question I think you're getting at is the role of natural history. Like, how could understanding or ignoring the larger kind of ecology in which we evolved, in which our bodies evolved, if we want to know how our body works, then you probably want to know something about the conditions under which it was made. What is that body designed to do? And I think we can get a better sense of that, not a perfect sense by any means, but a better sense in those settings that are more similar to how we used to live, and collectively across those settings. So the fact that, like you said, every hunter-gatherer group is a little bit different, and hunter-gatherers can be a little bit different than horticulturalists and herders, but they do have some similarities. And so getting the bigger picture, like, it's pretty amazing that if diets vary so widely across a lot of these different groups, but heart disease is relatively rare across all these settings, then that already tells us something, about a paleo diet, or which diet is best for avoiding heart disease, So I think there's already things that we can learn there. And, I do think that, the same logic has been applied for, if we want to understand the working of the mind, right? The whole field of evolutionary psychology is predicated on this idea that we need to know what were the selection pressures in the kinds of environments in which we evolved, largely, again, hunting and gathering. Uh, and so it is a similar kind of idea applied to our body, but also other aspects, the talking about sociality and our well-being more generally, that I think there's a lot that we can learn by paying attention. And some of it is also just maybe a bit historical, like even without like the magic 5 things you can do that hunter-gatherers do so you can live forever, like that's not what I tried to do in the book, although I think I did cave towards the end and gave a list anyway. But there's nothing shocking. It's not like there's this one plant that the Tsimane eat, that if you could eat this plant, you would live, an extra several years. And in fact,
Right.
the real story is that even though the Tsimane don't get heart disease and lower rates of dementia, they still die at higher rates than we do at every age, right? So it might not be good. Maybe we actually have learned quite a bit, and what we're doing might actually, in our current environment, might actually be better than doing exactly what a hunter-gatherer is doing. And so, some of what I was trying to do was like, burst open some of these myths and the tendency to just want to take what hunter-gatherers are doing, and then if we could do that, then we would be healthier, because sometimes that's true, but a lot of times that's not true. And again, because we didn't evolve to just live a long, healthy life, right? Survival is just one component of fitness. So there was all of that aspects too. I do think the whole idea of like, can we go back in time from studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers, and that's a much harder sell and that's not really what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to say, based on how the Ache and the Tsimane live, now we can make inferences about how we lived, 80,000 years ago. It's more about an understanding of, the role of different selection pressures. How would this have affected, making educated hypotheses about different aspects of our biology, our physiology, our psychological makeup. With this idea, though, that that's why I spend, some nerdy pages on uniformitarianism, right? This idea that, if X causes Y in one environment, then all else equal, X should cause Y in other environments. Now, it could be, unless A, B, and C, but if ideally you could have measures of all those things, if we could really understand what environments were like 80,000 years ago, then we could actually make informed guesses. And as I mentioned, working with contemporary small-scale societies, it's just one opportunity, one lens, but it's one that's been relatively untapped for a variety of reasons. And so that was sort of my angle, and what I wanted to help kind of contribute to all these conversations about health and aging and well-being, especially as we get older in both, our industrialized urban world, but then also, in rural settings as well.
I guess the thing about this that's interesting is that you can find a lot of the differences between different groups, but you can also find some of the things here that, okay, well, there's a human piece. If we can talk to people that are in an isolated context, more or less, or more, they don't live in an urban area like we do in modernized countries, so to speak. Okay, what's sort of the common denominator here in terms of humans? And so a big thing you talk about in the book, which was, I'll be honest, I went into the book blind. I just said, oh, this is cool. And I just kind of was chapter by chapter. I was like, oh, okay, where are we going? And so when I got to, I guess, the sort of middle-ish part of the book, You talk about multi-generational cooperation. That's a very important way to say it, I should say. So we started talking about this a little bit. So, I've talked to a few people on the podcast about this. Michael McCullough, who's written a book kind of more from the psychology lens, but on cooperation. Obviously, I've talked to the wonderful Nicola Rehani, who wrote a fantastic book on cooperation. And I'm sure other folks as well. Those are the two that come to mind. And they've written a lot about cooperation. And I think Nicola's point in her book, Social Instinct, is there's a dark side to cooperation, right? It's not just, oh, it's great, cooperation, we get together and we do good stuff. It's like, no, we also get together and cooperate to like kill people and and do other horrible things as well. And so, you talk about this as well in the book. You talk about interdependence, which is a little bit different than just cooperation generally. Obviously, there's the kin selection thing. So you talk all about it. I guess and you can phase into here the grandmother hypothesis too. And Nicola talks about it. Other people have talked about it. I think it was Kat Bohannon. She wrote a great book called Eve. It was a really good book. Yeah. And she talks about this as well. And she says that again, it's a nice hypothesis. It's not the only one there. It's, I think, the one that gets the most kind of legs in terms of people talking about it. But that there's this idea that maybe grandmothers have the social component, but that there's an element of wisdom that's needed for subsequent generations. And that's why there's a quote unquote utility for them. But there's interesting things about that. So yeah, tell us about how you're coming at this understanding of multi-generational cooperation, and you really kind of push us out into, I don't think you're intentionally trying to do this, maybe you are, but kind of making the case for like old age, like why folks when they're older are still extremely important. They're super necessary. You can build off of this from what you've learned, working with different quote unquote isolated groups in the jungles or whatever. But how do we understand this for humans about how we're needed? I'll just take one last thing and then I'll be quiet about this. But like most people, even in the modern world, do not have as many kids. One of the reason, it's not the only reason, but a reason is because they don't have that live down the road or the next house over or 10-minute drive away grandparents or an aunt or uncle or other people that can help out raising a kid, which is what used to happen for a long time. Even for myself, my grandmother lived 10 minutes away from me when I was growing up, and for a good part of my childhood. So like, yeah, how do we understand the idea of it doesn't have to just be a utilitarian argument, but the utility of old age and the value and importance of it, and in the context of, as a human thing, multi-generational cooperation?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I like what you said about the dark side of cooperation and sociality. One element of that, right, is the whole idea that you can be long-lived but be miserable because you don't feel socially connected, or you don't feel that you're of relevance to other people, you don't feel needed. All that stuff only makes sense in this sort of interdependent kind of mindset where, wow, isn't that great that no one needs me? That means no one's dependent on me. And it means I don't have to worry about doing this for someone or that for someone. One thing, it was really instructive, all else equal, you'd think, wow, isn't it great to be able to receive resources rather than having to give them away? But like in the Tsimane context, folks who were basically receiving more than they were giving were more depressed than the people who were giving away more than they received from others. So being in that position where you're a net giver, you're seen as important and relevant to lots of other people, that's a good thing to be. That's a good place to be. And we still act like that's the case, even though we're not really immersed in that interdependent kind of world. And so I agree that, part of that quality of life, especially in later ages, really stems out of some of this, reliance on cooperation for getting by. And, this idea about then what is old age for, and the role of wisdom and the role of, I do think, I was talking to a sociologist the other day. I was in Liverpool, of all places, and after I did my, Beatles walking tour, I, and they were talking to a sociologist who's like, does not like the grandmothering hypothesis, but I think, partly I think she was hung up on this idea, like, if you don't have grandchildren, then there's like no point of being alive. And so, in a low fertility kind of contemporary world, telling people that your only purpose in life is to care for younger generations, and, where's the humanism, and I don't think, and I think zooming out a little bit, I mean, we do things for other people we're unrelated to all the time. People want to be useful to others, whether or not they have grandkids or not. And I think that's the kind of spirit to capture, where one could be, and it's true, older people start talking about future generations way more. They're definitely, if anything, you would think the opposite, right? That is, if you're nearing the end game, it's like the classic prisoner's dilemma game, where if you're at the end and it's a finite number of rounds, you defect, and then you defect the previous round, and it unravels out. And so, and this used to be this idea that as you're getting near the end of life, that's like the end of a prisoner's dilemma. So you start defecting and say, screw the future, generations. But that's not exactly how people act, right? People do think about legacy and think about making a difference. No one on their deathbed says that they wish they could have worked more, right? And spend less time with their family and friends. And so I do think that there's definitely elements of rethinking this kind of older age, where, we've gone in different waves, right? This thinking about retirement, and ending work altogether, and then shifting to like vacation mode, that's where I'm like, that's very new. That's not something, there's no hunter-gatherers that are just going on vacation like, hey, they actually might go to different parts of the territory and visit kin that they haven't seen for a while. But let alone the fact that there's not like actual formal retirement, really does suggest that, you can get bored being on vacation. And yeah, there's so much more to see and more to do, but, ultimately there's so much to see and do in your own community that involves, making a difference in people's lives. And there's already big demand for that. But, the infrastructure isn't really set up. I talked even just to like local people here in my town who are involved in like different initiatives to get older adults sort of involved in their communities. And some of the biggest complaints you hear is that I can't drive, right? I don't live in a place that has enough buses, and I have no way of getting to the school where I could volunteer and help, teach kids who don't speak English to learn English. And so there's the desire there, but there's not really the means to make that happen. And so this is where I feel like there's all this untapped potential. And it doesn't matter that our population is getting older and older and older, because a large chunk of that growing older population is sort of in the young old range, right? I'm not talking about like 95-year-olds need to, rethink about, how they can contribute to communities, because unless those 95-year-olds in the future are going to have the health and mobility of like, say, 65-year-olds now, then that does become a bit harder to think about. But there's certainly plenty of people in their 60s and 70s who will be mobile and in reasonably good health, but they'll be retired. and we'll be trying to think about, what do they want to do with their kind of next stage in life. And there's a growing number of books and conversations about encore careers and the third career and fourth career, and new ways of sort of making contributions, even though the fact that we tend to think that our society is so youth oriented and that technology is moving so quickly that older people can't keep up. But that's where, even even with ChatGPT, let alone, old fashioned Google or old fashioned like encyclopedias, what older folks have to contribute, that kind of perspective, wisdom, for lack of a better word, that's not something you can easily just get from the web, or from a book. And so those contributions still matter even today.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the grandmother hypothesis is a hypothesis. It's a common one, but I think I agree with you. I think the spirit of it is, yeah. It's not just for your kin. Like it's for humans. Like there is an interdependent kind of notion to us as humans. I was thinking as you were saying this that, I know some people that are in their late 50s and they retire early for whatever reason, or there's a job change and they're like, well, I'm like 2-3 years out. I'm not going to go and try and apply for another job or whatever. And even sometimes people in their late 50s or very early 60s are still like, hey, like I still have a lot of like energy. Like my brain's still working really well. I still have a lot to offer. And a lot of people do want to do that. They do want to offer something. And should to I think idleness isn't very good, and I think one of the things, all mental disorders or ailments are all physical ailments and disorders to a certain extent, right? Because it's in the body, but like this idea of I'm 65 or 67, but I'm a young 65, right? I'm still running marathons, or I'm doing whatever, and I'm still like sharp as a tack. And it's like, yeah, we need those folks. We need those people to give us all of the right wisdom, for lack of a better word, but also, a lot of purpose, and I think that there's something on the social component of it, of like, seeing people of different generations, in a positive way, cooperative spirit can be, very inspiring, very kind of holistic in some ways. And, I think there are other cultures that probably do some version of this. So I think that, again, I think you're right. I think there are some books and some ideas that are trying to kind of popularize this and see what we're doing, because that's the point, right? Like if we're having, medicine and better eating habits, and, we're not smoking as much anymore, we're not drinking as much, and we're going to live longer and be healthier, well, then there's got to be a point, right? It's not just to be like, well, nobody needs me anymore. Like I retired and my kids are all grown, or I didn't have kids, so I'm just gonna, like there has to be a point for all of those things too. And I think that that's, it's a new wrinkle to try and figure out.
Yeah, I agree. And I think once those models exist, then younger generations, like seeing that, can develop new attitudes about aging. Sort of the less negativity and less, people focus on the disability aspects. What I find very instructive is when you compare what younger people think old age is like with what older people rating those exact same things, it's like, yeah, the younger people kind of get it wrong. They think it's way worse than people actually say it ends up being. And so, moving beyond that aspect, I think seeing, and it is true, I think because we are living longer, it's not like, right, there is that opportunity, even if you don't retire early, like in your 50s, but there's still this opportunity to contribute in a different way, and think even about kind of new careers, let alone just the option of continuing working without even retiring, or partial retirement, like being flexible and creative in the ways that people can kind of make contributions. so that it's also not just this idea that this is only for the wealthy who can then just volunteer, right? Because unfortunately, right, if Social Security is not around, people might have to work more because they don't have a choice. And so
Right.
it's not like a proactive, volunteering kind of decision, but I think feeling differently about that and appreciated and kind of networked and useful, is all part of, I think, how to not just integrate older folks, but kind of make it a win-win for everybody. And then I think the attitudes will kind of shift quite a bit too, because it's the case everywhere that there's always mixed messages about older people. So even in like societies where elders are held in high esteem with prestige, they're also you hear lots of disrespecting and bad mouthing and kind of negative views alongside. You just can't get away from that. That I think there's all these kind of mixed blessings about things, but I do think, yeah, thinking more creatively about those later years, and particularly when you're still reasonably healthy, and we should still continue working on health span, so that, sorry, one kind of digression that kind of comes back. Everyone's worried about the percent of the population that's going to be 65 and
Mm-hmm.
over,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, it's increasing, right? It's like 1 in 6 or so now in the U.S. and moving
Sounds right.
towards 1 in 5 and 1 in 4. And but that's relying on chronological age, right? Now, if you sort of in the future, if a 75-year-old is kind of like a 65-year-old, and that's certainly the case in terms of survival, but if we focused even on health, in other words, if we could
Mm-hmm.
improve health span and delay some of the chronic diseases of aging longer, then it actually turns out that increase, instead of just using 65 and older, but using increase of people who are like almost like biologically that age and older, it actually looks a lot flatter, which definitely changes like the panic. Like, okay, wow, we can have a whole bunch of people in these later ages that can still be contributing members of society in so many different ways. And so let's not panic, but let's actually work towards creating the potential that varied contributions can be made through as many different ways as possible. Because things aren't, I mean, yeah, there is ageism in the workplace, and there is a need for kind of retraining and maybe subsidizing a little bit if you have to go without a salary for a year because you're trying to reimagine, get new skills, and that kind of stuff. So I think there's so many ways we can think creatively about how to really just tap that potential in our later years, and it would be a win not just for those older people, but for all of society.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think people see it as, oh, for this person, or this age group is preoccupied with themselves, and maybe that's true, but it has impact for all generations.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
my final question here is what can we make of these evolved 7-decade lifespans that we have, and that we have all these things, right? We have cooperativeness, learning, intelligence, intensive parenting, and grandparenting. What do these things say for us as we continue to age in the 21st century?
Ooh. So what does it say for us? Well, I think it's instructive that while the details have changed about how everything I lay out, from food production and shares of food going from, elders to younger folks, to how it kind of this idea about utility and productivity and going from asset to burden, the details all are very different in modern society compared to hunting and gathering. But they're all analogous, right? And so thinking about our own productivity and being productive in a variety of ways, uh, thinking about caregiving, which is something we don't, we put a monetary price tag on it when we have to pay for it, but it sort of isn't part of the longevity economy as typically described, yet I think it's going to be. And so I think all that still plays into everything about our modern life and what's going on in 7 decades, 8 decades. We're still living past that point because I do think we probably are a little bit biologically younger than we were in the past and compared to people living in those hunting and gathering kind of worlds today. And I think part of the lesson, it just shows us in some ways how far we have still come far, although part of the lesson was also we haven't come as far as we think, right? That part of that lesson was that potential has been built into us. We've just gotten a lot better at sort of tapping into that potential by eliminating all the early deaths. And so it's kind of looking backwards in order to think about looking forwards. And that's why sort of the revisioning of the quality of life in later years and turning that untapped potential into productivity, into building communities. I mean, I feel like almost everything that's important for the future is going to involve tapping into what middle-aged and older adults can help contribute, from climate change to epidemics of loneliness to, inequalities in educational opportunities in our youth. I mean, these are all things where, middle-aged, older adults can make big contributions. And so I guess I just wanted to move the conversation away from just trying to live as long as possible in the longevity kind of tech kind of world and in a very we all do kind of want to live as long as possible if we could be guaranteed that we would be reasonably healthy to do so. I mean, current polls show people don't want to live to 100 because they're thinking about what it means, what it looks like to live to 100 now. And so, let's keep working on extending health span and all of that. But I do think we have to pay a lot more attention into the reality right now and the reality in the next, 20, 30 years. We haven't seen a single longevity breakthrough yet. The closest might actually be, Ozempic, right? Which is not an aging drug, but it's going to it could potentially make a huge dent in morbidity, in diabetes and obesity-related chronic morbidity, and that's certainly going to add extra years. And so, that's one dent. But I don't know. Was that a little bit what you're kind of looking for? I mean, I feel like
it's so interesting, right? Like we think about these things and it's like, and I agree, getting the focus off of, right, this kind of tech bro, how do we live forever kind of thing, and kind of keeping it centered on what we can have in our quality of life. And there's obviously great advancements in some ways, but it is just still interesting kind of going to the beginning of like, we do have a ceiling as a species. Like Homo sapiens have a sort of ceiling. We cannot live for 500 years. We can't live for 200 years, right? Like there is, even with everything preventative, really good care, we still have a sort of max. And that is, every species has that. And we have to in some ways accept that reality by having good quality of life, taking care of ourselves here, being on the healthier sides of cooperation, valuing as we get older, seeing the utility of that. All of these things, I think, is the best way to live maybe not 150 years, but we can live more fruitful and robust kinds of life, even if it is 75 years.
Yeah, and I think, part of the focus point of 7 decades, right? It wasn't to say like that's a limit, or that was even a limit in the past. But it is still a relevant focus point, because whether we're talking about hunter-gatherers or we're even talking about, in our society now, it's not like 7 decades is totally irrelevant, because, yeah, you might be able to make it to 8 or 9, but there's still a lot happening in that period, in that transition, and the lead up to that sparks all these things about what should I be doing with my life? How should I be thinking about a new career? What about my family and my grandkids? And maybe I didn't have any family or any kids or grandkids. And so how do I build community? Why do I, and rethinking about those critical years, especially if one thinks that even though survival can go on longer, but those are still my pretty healthy years. So it's a centerpiece of a conversation, I think, rather than like the definitive estimate of like, this is how long we lived, take it or leave it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that framing. Michael, well, I gotta say, the book's great. It's fantastic. You are absolutely wonderful in conversation. An hour and a half felt like 5 minutes. So I really, really enjoyed this. It was really, really just real splendid. I really liked this conversation and really like the work you're doing. So I can't say enough thanks for coming on and sharing all of your thoughts and your wisdom on this.
Yeah, thanks, Xavier. I really enjoyed it. It flew by for me as well. So I thought we were just getting started. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, no, thank you.